Hello recruits, this is Robbie Grayson and I'm back with General Schneider, and this is lesson number 4 in Bootcamp with the General. In the last lesson we talked about integrity, and the General described how integrity really is the connection of your inner life with your outer life. It's got to match up. In this lesson we're talking about dedication, which is the ability to bridge kind of the big vision you have for your life with the smallest detail to make it happen. All right, General, in your book, Jet Pioneer, you give us a lot of very interesting stories. Stories that haven't been told anywhere else about what life was like at the beginning of the United States Air Force. Right. And there's a story in here I feel that connects with this theme of dedication. Mm-hmm. And it's a story of your being lost over the Atlantic. Do you mind telling us that in detail?
Well, this was we'd been to the Air Force worldwide gunnery meet out in Las Vegas, and we were heading back to Germany. And I was leading this flight back to Europe, and we hopped across the United States and ended up in Harmon, Newfoundland. And the weather had been bad. We'd been sitting around there for 3 or 4 days waiting for the weather to clear. It was really cold, and the instruments probably got pretty well frozen up. And anyway, we got a weather forecast at the Azores, which is about 1,500 miles out in the middle of the North Atlantic, that the weather was okay, so we could take off. So we taxied out on runway. I was leading the first flight, and we had a flight of 4, and the number 3 man had some mechanical problems, so I told him to go back and get those fixed. So just 2 of us took off. And I called the tower and I said, looks like a snowstorm moving in from the north. They said, yeah, it may be here pretty soon. So we took off and we got over Argentia, which is the very eastern tip of Newfoundland. And I checked in at 35,000 feet, gave a position report, and told them that we flight at 2 at 35,000 feet, heading for the Azores. And a third of the way across the route was an orbiting ship that we were with our radio compass had been working properly. We could have homed in on that ship. And then halfway was an orbiting aircraft. We could home on them. 2/3 of the way was another ship orbiting that we could home on. And then at Lodges, the Azores, our final destination out in the middle of the Atlantic, we could there. Anyway, I checked in at Argentia, and that's the last I heard. My wingman had pulled up on my wing, and he said his receiver was out. Well, at first he said his transmitter's out, just with hand signals, told me that. Then he said his receiver's out, and then a little bit he gave me an indication that his navigation equipment had gone out. Of course, the planes had been sitting on the ramp there for several days. Wow. Anyway, so I checked in, and I got to that first ship, and I was going to make a position report, and I didn't hear anything. So I knew that my transmitter and my receiver were out, and I thought, well, I've still got radio compass there because I'd spotted that first ship. And then I looked down and my radio compass was going around and around. So I'd lost navigation and radio contact with the ground and with my wingman. So I had no choice. When I checked in at Argentia, they said, yeah, the snowstorm has moved over the base and it's 0-0. And I said, any alternates? Said, nothing on the East Coast. There's no way there's no alternates, 0-0. And the weather was supposed to be pretty good in the Azores, so I just pressed on. I had no choice. So we were sitting there at 500 miles an hour for 3 hours just looking at the radio compass. Wow. I mean, just looking at the magnetic compass. And I said, the only way that we're going to survive is that low overcast over the ocean. And, of course, you can see icebergs and so forth. But I said, there's a little peak that's about 10 or 15 miles west of the field. And if I can spot that peak, if it's sticking up through the clouds, we're saved. If not, we're going to die. So we were about 100 miles off course. Of course, we didn't know the winds. We couldn't get the correction. But I picked up that peak, and so we were both on minimum fuel. So I motioned my wingman, well, get your power back and let's get down. He'd already told me that he's minimum fuel, and I was minimum fuel. So we just headed for over that peak, and my initiative was, I looked at my map and I said, it's about 125 degrees from that peak to the field, so we're just going to let down. And of course, we had no we didn't know what the altimeter setting was, so you know how high you're above the ground. So I was just letting down, and I said, if we go over the field and we can see the field, we've just got enough field to circle and land. If we don't see it, then we're just going to do a 180 and bail out over the ground. Well, we came right over the field, and the weather was right down on the deck. And I motioned Wingman to get out and get your gear down. We peeled around and just made a circling approach and landed, pulled off the runway, and my engine quit, and he pulled right up behind me, and his engine quit. So that's how close we came. But I guess the point there is so many people would depend so much on their instruments, they don't have the creative thought. If I hadn't thought about that mountain coming up through the clouds, right, we wouldn't have made it. So you just got to be constantly thinking of alternatives of situations if you get into a bind. So that one sort of saved our hide.
That's something else. Yeah, problem solving, I think, is a skill set that needs to be developed at an early age.
Yeah.
And the more hands-on educators and teachers and mentors are, it's very difficult for a student to develop that hardiness. Mm-hmm. So when most kids nowadays, I'd imagine, have like huge visions for their lives, mm-hmm, and because they're more relational, I would say, than my generation was. Mm-hmm. Because they're more relational, they tend to share the character traits among themselves that used to be in one person.
Oh,
so when it comes to, one person might be the big vision guy, and all he does is big vision, big vision, big right, vision. But then other people might be the detail people. So speak to the benefit of actually developing, if you're a big vision person, mm-hmm, the benefit of developing kind of the detailed skill sets.
Well, you need to do both, and then you need to be. Let's go back to an analogy of plowing a field. The big vision is you're going to get the field plowed and you're going to get seed put in the ground, but you still got to be detailed on how you contour your rows and so forth. Right. So you need to have both. You need to be. You don't want to be a micromanager. If you're a leader, you still got to pick good people and let them do their job, but you still got to have a vision for anything you're going to do. Just like Jackson was saying, he had a vision to be in the business he's in now and started at age 12. But you still got to watch the details, so you just have to do both. And if you're going to school, you just want to do the very best you can in your studies and there, but have a vision of where you want to go and how that study integrates into your overall vision.
Right, that makes sense. You told me the story of Eisenhower and the order that he gave.
Yeah,
Allied forces.
Yeah, well, you think about all the planning that had to go into landing all the thousands of people and equipment on the shore in World War II on Europe. And his order from the president and the General Marshal was Allied forces on the mainland of Europe and effect unconditional surrender of all Axis powers. Period. That was his direct total order. So he had to come up with all these thousands and thousands of plans, all the logistics. Had to have the pipeline put under the Atlantic Ocean to get fuel into all the forces there. So that was a massive vision plan, right, but millions of details that had to come together to actually get the forces on the landing at D-Day.
That's right. So every huge vision has to be balanced out by an equal amount of detail.
Yeah, you've got to put the foundation under the vision. You can vision this great big building, multi-story building, but you got to put that foundation in, and then all the details that go into where you put the windows, how you put the doors, and how you build a structure that way. And it's sort of like building your life. You may have a vision of where you want to go, but there's a lot of details along the way that you need to put in there and think about and plan for in order to get to your final goal.
Right. So what advice would you give young men who are kind of vision heavy, or they are vision focused, and they don't put a lot of time into working out the details. And as a result, they experience this ongoing frustration.
Well, that's why you just need to have as I was saying, Jackson, have a vision as early in life as you can, so you have time then to explore and learn, study, and plan to get to where you want to go, and take courses or study or talk to other people or learn the technical details, stay up with technology because it's fast changing. That's what we're doing right now. You know, we couldn't have done this 20, 30 years ago. So it's a combination. You've got to have the vision, and then you've got to do some detailed planning to get to where you want to go.
Right, and I guess what's key to that is making sure that you've built some time into it, so that you're not panicked or you're not stressed, or it's not a matter of urgency for you to develop those detailed skill sets.
Yeah, the earlier you can plan for anything, it's like going to college. If I got an assignment that was 2 or 3 weeks away, the professor would say, we're going to have a final exam or you got to turn in a paper. I'd immediately start doing research on the paper and maybe sketch out the general plan that first night. And then every day I'd allocate a little bit of time to get that. And I'd always try to finish it about 2 or 3 days before it had to be turned in, so I could polish it up and make any final changes. And I saw my classmates panicking, sitting there all night long studying up for an exam or trying to get a paper finished up. And I was sitting there having a cup of coffee and relaxing, so it made a big difference.
So to be a dedicated individual, it means you've got to take responsibility for both sides, the vision, as well as the detail.
Well, my academic career is a good example. You know, my vision was to get an undergraduate degree and get a master's degree. So year after year, I kept going to night school along with flying airplanes and raising a family and doing all that. 19 years later, I finally got my undergraduate degree. 3 more years of going to night school to get a master's degree. But that was my vision, that I was going to get there. I didn't care how well I cared, but it took a long time to do it. But it's dedication and persistence and staying with your goals if they're worthwhile.
Something else. Tell us about this helmet here.
Well, this is a more advanced model of the first helmets we started with. If you look at my book there, you see the old helmet. We didn't even have a visor or any. So, and they had straps that came up from the bottom here and tied right up here, and had a leather thong up here. And when you pull your oxygen mask real tight, it just burned a hole in your head. It didn't burn a hole literally, but it felt like it. Right. And this one now was molded to my head. They took an impression of my head, and it just fits like a glove. Man, it just really felt good. So I've flown several thousand hours with this helmet, and it's getting pretty long in the tooth now. But this oxygen hose fits into the airplane, so you can draw your oxygen, and you can move your visor up and down, and and then you can click in your oxygen mask right here. So a big improvement over the years from what we had initially. The very first ones, we didn't even have jet helmets when I first started flying. You'd take your old P-51 leather helmet and had earphones in it. Then you go down to a local sporting goods store and buy a football helmet, and just the old round one. You look like Newt Rockney, you know. It just had the straps and bring that down there. Wow. The old round helmet. Then we got the first jet helmets a few months after I started flying. But,
you know, kind of like the control stick. You know, there is some detail that goes into knowing how to utilize all these complex parts, or knowing how they fit together in order to allow you to kind of complete your mission.
Sure.
You know? Which is kind of the vision.
Yeah, we had back in the days when we were worried about a nuclear strike, we had a couple of different visors here you could put down that would really be dark, so it'd cut out an atomic blast if we ever dropped an atomic bomb. But this one you keep up while you're on the ground, but then you get in the air and you get up altitude, you want to put your visor down. And then it gives you protection if you have to bail out too. Well, I think a lot of things are just study and read and talk to people, and perhaps visit different professions or different people if you can, and then read until you get to the point where you have a passion for doing something, like you're talking about getting into photography at age 12. That you find out that really excites you and you like to do it. So you need to have a vision as early in life as you can, and then God has a plan for everybody's life. That's in my belief. But you really got to, you can't just sit on your tail and assume it's going to happen. You got to get out and do something. So I use the analogy of the invasion of Europe in World War II. The direction for General Eisenhower was, from the President of the United States, was land Allied forces on the mainland of Europe and effect unconditional surrender of all Axis powers, period. That was his order. But think of the millions and millions of details and logistics and planning that had to go into landing the forces on Europe and beating the Axis powers. So that's sort of an analogy for your life. You really need to think about what your vision is, but then you've got to work the details. You've got to study, you've got to plan, you've got to talk to people, get experience and so forth to achieve that long-term goal. And as I said, my goal was to get a undergraduate degree and a master's degree in my profession, which was U.S. Air Force. So I started going to night school and I ended up with 200 semester hours of undergraduate work just to get 125 credit hours to get my undergraduate degree 9 years later, and then another 3 years of going to night school to get my master's degree. So I just was determined that was my vision. I was going to have both of these in order to move up in my career, and whatever it took, I was just going to have to do it, and I did. Plus, I was raising a family. I was flying airplanes. I was traveling all over the world. And I just kept working the plan. So everybody needs to have something like that. First have the vision, and then put the foundation under it, and then do what you have to do to get to your ultimate goal.